Hi guys, and welcome to our model on the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped or C-shaped musculotendinous structure that tends to sit at the inferior thoracic outlet. It separates the thorax above from the abdomen below, and it allows for the movement of structures from the thorax to the abdomen or from the abdomen into the thorax. Usually, although it is double dome, the right dome is higher up compared to the left dome, and then this is due to the fact that the lever tends to push the right dome a little bit upwards compared to the left. So, as I said before, the diaphragm is located in the inferior thoracic aperture or outlet. Its convex superior surface tends to be serving as the floor of the thoracic cavity, whereas the concave inferior surface of the diaphragm serves as the roof of the abdomen. So if this is the abdomen here, and this is the thorax here, the diaphragm sits between them, separating them. The diaphragm tends to be dome shaped, it's double dome, so it looks like this, with the right side being more superior than the left. The convex superior surfaces of the right dome and the left dome would face the thorax and form the floor of the thorax. Then the concave inferior surface of the right and left dome would face the abdomen and form the roof of the abdomen, as shown here. The functions of the diaphragm is in the function of structure as well as that of respiration. So structurally, it separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And then in terms of respiration, the diaphragm is present for the purpose of inspiration. When we inspire, the diaphragm tends to flatten out, and the flattening out of the diaphragm allows for the lungs to expand further within the thoracic cavity. So as shown here, when we have inspiration, that diaphragm flattens out, and this increases the thoracic diameter or the entire thoracic space or capacity. When we expire, diaphragm would eventually bulge up, and that bulging upward is like its normal or neutral position. That bulging upward will reduce the thoracic diameter and automatically push air out of the lungs. The last function of the diaphragm is in the function of maintaining intraperitoneal pressure. So, when we inspire or expire, pressures within the abdominal cavity will change, and that tends to assist in a number of functions, especially when we strain or when we carry out abdominal related activities. So, the diaphragm is involved in changing intraperitoneal pressures. Structurally, the diaphragm is described as a musculotendinous structure. That means it's composed of muscular and tendinous parts. The muscle structure of the diaphragm is found at its periphery, at its edges. The fibers tend to converge radially on the tendinous part. So we have the muscular parts fanning out, as shown here. So these areas are the muscular part of the diaphragm. You can see them fanning out, but eventually they tend to converge and meet at the tendinous part. The tendinous part lies at the center of the diaphragm. It anchors the diaphragm to the pericardium above it. So the heart sits directly on the diaphragm, is anchored to the diaphragm by the tendinous part of the diaphragm. And you notice that the tendinous part of the diaphragm is um, largely the point of attachment of the muscular part, like I mentioned. Let's dive a little bit deeper, talking about the muscular part and the tendinous part of the diaphragm. The muscular part of the diaphragm tends to form a continuous sheet of muscle attaching to the peripheral structures or in relation to the diaphragm. However, we divide it into three parts based on where it is attached to. So, the muscular part of the diaphragm includes the sternal portion, the costal portion, and the vertebral portion. And as the name implies, this just describes the parts that are attached to different aspects of the entire thoracic structures. So the sternal part tends to attach to the sternum, the costal part tends to attach to the ribs, and the vertebral part tends to attach to the vertebrae. So the sternal part of the diaphragm is the smallest part of the diaphragm. It is not always present. This is the external part. You can see how tiny it is. Not always present in all individuals, and it begins from the xiphoid process. Hence the reason why we call it the sternal part, because it's attaching to the xiphoid process of the sternum, and it inserts at the central tendon of the diaphragm, which is the tendinous part here. So this is where it's inserting at. So it originates from this point at the xiphoid process and inserts at this point, which is a small chunk of the tendinous portion of the diaphragm. The part or the nerve that innervates the sternal portion of the diaphragm is the phrenic nerve. The costal part of the diaphragm is the largest part of the diaphragm. It spans the large chunk of the ribs that tends to flank it. And usually, the costal part of the diaphragm is what we tend to refer to as the right and left dooms of the diaphragm because it is the largest portion. It originates from the lowest six ribs that are found at its sides. So, if you pay attention, you notice that at the sides of this aspect of the diaphragm, this is the costal part of the diaphragm. At the sides would be the ribs. So, from the lower six rib, the costal part of the diaphragm tends to attach to it, originating from that point. And then in terms of insertion, all those um, costal portion of the diaphragm would insert on at the periphery or centrally to the central tendon or the fibrous or tendinous part of the diaphragm. You can see how they're inserting at this point. Each of them tend to radiate and insert at the tendinous part of the diaphragm. In terms of nerve supply, the costal diaphragm tends to also be innervated by the phrenic nerve. Then we have the vertebral part of the diaphragm. The vertebral part of the diaphragm tends to form a number of structures that attaches to the vertebrae. Usually, the vertebral part of the diaphragm attaches to the lumbar vertebrae and attaches to the first down to the third lumbar vertebrae. The different substructures of the vertebral part of the diaphragm includes the right cruise and left cruise of the diaphragm, the medial arcuate ligament, and the lateral arcuate ligament. I'll show you pictures of how this looks like and talk about what each of them tend to entail. First of all, the vertebral part of the diaphragm is a musculotendinous bundle. So it's made up of both muscle and tendon. Usually, part of the tendinous part of the diaphragm tends to merge with the vertebral part of the diaphragm, and it tends to attach to the anterior surface of the vertebral column, attaches to the intervertebral disc, and also attaches to the anterior longitudinal ligaments, that part of the vertebrae. The right cruise portion of the vertebral part of the diaphragm is the largest portion, and it's also the longest portion. It's larger and longer than the on the left cruise. So this is the right cruise in the image. You can see this band of muscle slash tendon. This is the right cruise. It tends to attach to the first down to the third lumbar vertebrae, the anterior surface of the lumbar vertebrae, and it's longer compared to the left. The left is the aspect shown in the image here. Just lies on the left side of the vertebrae, separated by a space. And so the left compared to the right tends to start from the second lumbar vertebrae down to the third. So for the right cruise starts from the first lumbar vertebrae down to the third or sometimes the fourth lumbar vertebrae. The left cruise, on the other hand, starts from the second lumbar vertebrae down to the third lumbar vertebrae. And that's the reason why the right cruise is longer compared to the left. Another important thing to note about the right cruise is that the right cruise has a bit of opening or defects on its most proximal portion. So if I have to trace the right cruise of the diaphragm all the way up, it begins somewhere around here, and if you notice, there's a tiny opening found at the proximal part of the right cruise. This tiny opening is known as the esophageal hiatus. So the esophageal hiatus is formed at the right cruise of the diaphragm. And that's one important thing to note about the right cruise compared to the left. Between the right and the left cruise of the diaphragm is a band of ligaments connecting them. So if you notice, if this is the right cruise and this is the left cruise, between them is a ligament connecting them together. And this ligament that connects them together at this point, as I'm drawing here, is known as the median arcuate ligament. So the median arcuate ligament unites the right and left screws. And this median arcuate ligament, if you notice, there's a big gap that it tends to form between the right and left screws. This big gap is known as the aortic hiatus. So we'll talk about some of these hiatus very soon. That's the esophageal hiatus on the right screws, and then the aortic hiatus between the right and left screws. When we get to the aspect of the openings of the diaphragm. So usually the median arcuate ligament is a ligament that tends to connect the right and left screws of the diaphragm. Then we have some other extra parts, like the medial arcuate ligament and the lateral arcuate ligament. Now, the medial arcuate ligament is a band of thickened fascia or thickened ligament that tends to cover the psoas major muscle. It tends to span the between the run between the lumbar vertebral bodies and the tip of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. So this is the medial arcuate ligament in the image here. So this is the medial arcuate ligament. It extends from the right cruise of the diaphragm down to the um, costal part of the costal portion of the diaphragm, and this is the medial arcuate ligament here. So you can see it's running from the body of the vertebrae to the transverse process of the vertebrae at this point. That's the medial arcuate ligament. And then we have the lateral arcuate ligament. Lateral arcuate ligament is an extension as well, the ligamentous or tendinous extension as well of the costal part of the diaphragm. The lateral arcuate ligament tends to cover the quadratus lumborum muscle. The so just as the medial arcuate ligament is covering, so this medial arcuate ligament here covers the psoas major muscle. So this is psoas major muscle is covered by the medial arcuate ligament. The lateral arcuate ligament, this aspect I'm drawing here, covers the quadratus lumborum muscle. It's not really clear in this image, but you will notice them if you pay attention. So is the this is the psoas major muscle. This is the quadratus lumborum muscle. You can see how the psoas major muscle is covered by the medial arcuate ligament. I can see how the quadratus lumborum muscle is covered by the lateral arcuate ligament. The lateral arcuate ligament tends to run from that transverse process all the way to the tip of the 12th rib. So that's how it extends. And this is practically the extra structures that the vertebral part of the diaphragm tends to form. All the vertebral portion of the diaphragm tends to eventually insert at the central tendon, which we'll talk about in the next slide. The tendinous part of the diaphragm is also known as central tendon. It's composed of a trifoliate central aponeurosis. And the reason why I say trifoliate is because it looks like a leaf that has three leaflets to it. If you notice, so this is one leaflet, these two leaflets, these three leaflets. That's why we call it a trifoliate central aponeurosis. It's fused superiorly with the inferior surface of the fibrous pericardium. So above it is the fibrous pericardium that is directly anchored to it, and it serves as the site of convergence for all the different aspects of the muscular portion of the diaphragm. So the vertebral diaphragm, costal diaphragm, and the sternal diaphragm, they all converge radially on the central tendon. Central tendon also has its own fair share of opening, just as how the right cruise of the diaphragm has an opening. The median arcuate ligament has an opening just below it. The central tendon of the diaphragm also has its own opening. That opening is known as the caval opening. And this is the opening shown in the image here. Let's jump right into talking about the openings of the diaphragm. We'll start with the major opening of the diaphragm, and then we'll talk about the minor openings of the diaphragm. There are three major openings we see in diaphragm. This includes the caval hiatus or caval opening, then the esophageal hiatus, and then the aortic hiatus. The caval opening, I said before, is found on the central tendon. It tends to be related to the 8th thoracic vertebrae. So we say it's related to T8, and the structures that tend to pass through this opening from the thorax to the abdomen, or from the abdomen to the thorax, includes the inferior vena cava. That's the reason why we call it the cava opening in the first place, and then the right phrenic nerve. Then below that, we have the esophageal hiatus. The esophageal hiatus, like I said, is found or is formed on the right cruise of the diaphragm. It is related to the 10th thoracic vertebrae, and it tends to carry the esophagus, hence the reason why we call it the esophageal hiatus, along with the vagus nerve. So the right and left vagus nerve passes through the esophageal hiatus to enter into the abdomen. The last major opening is the aortic hiatus. The aortic hiatus is related to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. It is found on the central. It is found below the medial arcuate ligament. Sorry, below the median arcuate ligament. I need to be careful with that. So median arcuate ligament, and it is an opening that serves as a passage for the aorta. That's the reason why we call it aortic hiatus in the first place. Besides the aorta, the thoracic duct and the azygos vein also passes through the aortic opening. This is the image showing us the different openings of the diaphragm, the different major openings of the diaphragm. Starting with, you see the caval hiatus on the central tendon that allows the passage of the inferior vena cava. We'll also notice the esophageal hiatus just on the right cruise allows for the passage of the esophagus and the vagus nerve. And then finally, you'll also see the median arcuate ligament allowing for the aortic hiatus below it. That allows for the passage of the aorta and the thoracic duct and azygos vein, although not shown in the image here. Besides the three major openings of the diaphragm, we have some minor openings to pay attention to. This includes the foramen of Morgani, or also known as the sternocostal foramen, the aperture of the medial arcuate ligament, and the aperture of the crura of the diaphragm. So each of these structures allows for the passage of different smaller vascular or neural structures that we should pay attention to. So the sternocostal foramen or the foramen of Morgani, for example, carries or allows for the passage of the superior epigastric vessel and the fatigues from the liver. And the aperture of the medial arcuate ligaments allows for the sympathetic trunk to pass through. And then finally, the aperture of the crura of the diaphragm allows for the greater splanchnic nerves, the lesser splanchnic nerves, part of the azygos vein sometimes, and then the hemiazygos veins to pass through. Let's talk quickly about the neurovascular supply to the diaphragm. In terms of arterial supply and venous drainage, the arterial supply to the diaphragm comes from the superior and inferior phrenic arteries, the musculophrenic artery coming from the intercostal artery, and then the pericardiophrenic artery. The venous drainage of the diaphragm is largely going to be by the superior and inferior phrenic veins. Lymphatic drainage of the diaphragm tends to occur at four major sites. Lymph from the diaphragm will drain to the anterior diaphragmatic lymph nodes, the posterior diaphragmatic lymph nodes, the phrenic lymph nodes, and the superior lumbar lymph nodes. In terms of nerve supply to the diaphragm, there are three major nerves supplying the diaphragm, one of which is extremely important. The first will be the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is the major nerve supply to the diaphragm, and if there's a damage to the phrenic nerve, that will lead to the um, paralysis of the diaphragm occurring, and as a result, that can affect breathing. Because remember that the function of the diaphragm, aside structurally dividing the abdomen from the thorax, is also in terms of the function of respiration. The phrenic nerve comes from the third, fourth, and fifth rami of the cervical spinal nerves. And once there's a damage or to the phrenic nerve, usually one of the symptoms we tend to see is that we tend to see what we call a referred pain around the shoulder area, around where C3, C4, and C5 tends to be. So you could have pain at the trapezoid ridge, that's C3, C4. You could have pain at the shoulder tip, that's C5. And this usually could occur when there's a damage to the phrenic nerve, or even when there's an irritation of the diaphragm. So, irritation of the diaphragm usually due to a pneumoperitoneum or hemoperitoneum or peritonitis or peritoneal abscess or maybe a cholecystitis or splenic rupture. Any condition that could lead to irritation of the diaphragm could present as a referred pain on the shoulder or on the trapezoid region. That's because of the fact that the phrenic nerve supplies the diaphragm, and the phrenic nerve comes all the way up from C3, C4, C5. Besides the phrenic nerve, we have the inferior intercostal nerves and the subcostal nerve also supplying a part of the diaphragm. Let's talk about the development of the diaphragm. Embryologically, the diaphragm tends to originate from four major sources. Each of these four parts will diverge and eventually give rise to different parts of the diaphragm. They include the septum transversum, the peritoneal membrane, the dorsal mesentery of the esophagus, and then the muscular ingrowth from the lateral body wall. Let's talk about each of these different aspects of the diaphragm and what they eventually give rise to in the adult structure. Septum transversum is a thick mass of mesoderm that tends to be located between the primitive heart tube and the developing liver. And during development, it migrates to the part or the area that is beneath the developing heart. And eventually, it will give rise to the central tendon of the diaphragm. So it gives rise to that tendinous portion of the diaphragm in adults. So just remember that the septum transversum will form the tendinous portion of the diaphragm, also known as central tendon. The peritoneal membrane is also called the post-hepatic mesenchymal plate. They are sheets of somatic mesoderm that are located on either sides of the esophagus, and although they form a large portion of the early fetal diaphragm, usually with time this would regress, and in the adult structure they will give rise to just a small part of the diaphragm. A small portion of the diaphragm would be the derivative of the peritoneal membrane. So it's just important to know that peritoneal membrane initially in fetal structure forms a large chunk of the diaphragm, but in the adult structure forms a small portion of the diaphragm. Let's talk about the dorsal mesentery of the esophagus. This is derived from myoblasts that invades the mesoesophagus. It tends to constitute the median portion of the diaphragm. Usually, it forms a muscular part of the diaphragm, but on the median part. And it is involved in forming the crura of the diaphragm. Remember that we have two crura, the right and the left crus, which are part of the vertebral portion of the diaphragm. So that vertebral part of the diaphragm that includes the right and left crus is gotten from this dorsal mesentery of the esophagus. And finally, we have the muscular ingrowth from the lateral walls. The lateral body wall contribute to the muscles of the diaphragm, and eventually will give rise to the peripheral portion of the diaphragm that includes the cervical, that includes the costal rather, and the sternal part of the diaphragm. So the costal and sternal part of the diaphragm is gotten from the muscular ingrowth from the lateral walls, and this usually tends to eventually emerge from the 9th to 12th week of intrauterine life. So during the fourth week, the septum transversum initially lies opposite to the third and fifth cervical somites. Then with time, rapid growth of the dorsal part of the embryo's body results in an apparent descent of the diaphragm. So during the fifth week, the myoblasts from these somites tend to migrate into the developing diaphragm, then bringing their nerve fibers to it. And this is the reason why we have the phrenic nerve eventually supplying the diaphragm. Phrenic nerve comes all the way up from the third to fifth cervical somite. The diaphragm initially began from the third to fifth cervical somite, but migrated down to the junction between the thorax and the abdomen when the embryo begins to grow. Muscles from that third to fifth part of the cervical somite will now migrate all the way down, bringing the phrenic nerve to supply. And that's the origin point of how the phrenic nerve eventually gives rise to the nerve supply to the diaphragm. Usually, the diaphragm begins at the same site where the phrenic nerve starts from, but migrates down. So the phrenic nerve would migrate all the way alongside muscle structures to where the diaphragm is to supply it. By the sixth week, the diaphragm is at the level of the thoracic somite as it's migrating. By the eighth week, we have the diaphragm descending to L4, as where it eventually becomes the adult structure, usually located in between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, and then it tends to undergo rapid growth alongside the neural tube. Some clinical significances to remember includes diaphragm paralysis. Paralysis of the diaphragm occurs when there's a damage to the phrenic nerve. This usually will present on chest X-ray as a flattened diaphragm. Remember, the diaphragm is meant to be dome-shaped. Whenever we see a flattened diaphragm, this is due to the fact that there's paralysis as a result of damage to the phrenic nerve. Then there are other important clinical significances that like the congenital diaphragmatic or hernias or acquired diaphragmatic hernias. This is a scenario where we have structures in the abdomen bulging through openings of the diaphragm to enter into the thoracic cavity. So we typically see that when there is either in abnormal development of the pleuroperitoneal membrane, one of those four structures involved in forming the diaphragm. When the pleuroperitoneal membrane is not formed well, it can lead to an abnormal space forming in the diaphragm. and that can lead to a congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Or whenever there's a weakness of the esophageal hiatus, the esophageal hiatus serves as an opening for the esophagus. Whenever there's a weakness of the esophageal hiatus around the esophagus, we can have the stomach slipping into the thorax, and as a result, we have the um, we have an acquired diaphragmatic hernia from there. Then finally, we can have diaphragmatic eventuation, and that's usually due to damage of the diaphragm and automatically structures that are found either below the diaphragm eventually move into the thoracic cavity. And that concludes our module on the diaphragm.